Hi, everyone. Welcome to Life of Riley's August webinar. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chaitana. I am the Chief Grants Officer at SpringPoint Partners, and I am also the Program Director for Life of Riley, which is SpringPoint's animal welfare initiative. I love seeing SpringPoint's partners from different social justice and animal welfare areas come together to address multidimensional and interrelated challenges facing our communities in a more holistic manner. So I am very happy to introduce Adam Gordon from the Fair Share Housing Center and Ross Barker from the Michelson Center for Public Policy to talk to us about leveraging state and local policy to create pet-inclusive housing. Whether we're working to ensure everyone in our community has access to housing that accommodates all of their family members, including the furry and four-legged family members, or whether we're working to keep dogs and cats out of our overcrowded shelters and with the families who love them, I think today's webinar will provide some essential learnings. And there will be some time at the end of Adam and Ross's presentation for Q&A as well. So without further ado, I'm just going to pass this over to Adam and Ross. Thanks so much for being here today.
Well, thank you so much, Jana. It's really wonderful to be here with all of you on a very important and timely topic. I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on who we are, turn it over to Ross to talk about Michelson and the Pet Inclusive Housing Initiative, and then we're going to go back and forth some on talking about policy strategies in this area. I'm Adam Gordon. I'm the Executive Director of Fair Share Housing Center. And really excited to be here with Ross Barker, the Program Director for Pet Inclusive Housing at Michelson Found Animals. Ross, if you want to go to the next slide, please. And Fair Share Housing Center is a nonprofit advocacy organization that has worked for the past 50 years to combine legal, policy, and community organizing and building strategies to dismantle decades of racial and economic discrimination in New Jersey and across the country. What does that mean? Our vision is that every community in New Jersey and nationally is open to people regardless of race, ethnicity, income level, and it's open to everybody, and that certainly includes people should be able to be with their pets wherever that they want. Our work originates from a landmark legal decision that provided a template for many other places in the country, requiring that every community open its doors to affordable housing, provide their fair share, as it's called, and that inspired our name. We've created over 75,000 long-term affordable homes since then, and we've expanded our work to look at how this work intersects with key policy areas. We brought the biggest federal Fair Housing Act complaint in American history, leading to over $500 million being allocated from Superstorm Sandy recovery to communities of color and lower communities. And we've been focusing increasingly on closing the racial wealth gap in past years and creating more access to home ownership. And I'll turn it over to Ross to give some background on his organization's work and pet friendly and pet inclusive housing.
Thanks, Adam. And thanks, Chaitana and everyone for joining us. And thanks to SpringPoint for inviting us to be with you. We're excited to be talking about this topic and coming together on something a little different than what we've done separately, I think, in the past. I am Ross Barker, the Director of Pet Inclusive Housing Initiative at Michelson Found Animals. We call ourselves PIHI just to shorten and to make it easier to think about our work and talk about it. Before moving into my role with Michelson and PIHI, I spent more than 2 decades leading research and insights teams in the private sector. So I tend to approach housing questions from very much a data and systems perspective, not only from an animal welfare perspective, but trying to take this broader view. So I want to talk a little about how that work then fits into what Michelson and PIHI does. So I'm part of Michelson Found Animals, which is part of this larger umbrella of foundations called Michelson Philanthropies. It's a network of initiatives that looks to bring systems change across areas, including education, medical research, public policy, and animal welfare. For us at PIHI, we apply that systems change approach to housing specifically, and we help expand access to pet inclusive housing, rental housing in particular, through partnerships, practical policy solutions that support both housing providers and renters. And that combination is important because we're focused not only on advocacy, we're also focused on looking at how all the pieces work together. So policies, financing systems, industry practices, and information gaps that shape the housing market. So at its core, our work is about alignment of these things, trying to bring them in line together to serve the families that we are trying to serve. A large majority of households include pets, but today the rental housing system does not often reflect that reality. In particular, when we look beyond whether a property technically allows a pet, we see problems and we see this gap. So we're examining the restrictions, costs, and uncertainty that renters encounter as a result of these things. That misalignment affects housing access, housing stability, property operations for the businesses, and increasingly public policy and housing finance. So what we want to talk about today is, I'm going to begin by explaining why this issue matters, why pets inclusive housing matters. Adam's then going to walk us through LIHTC and qualified allocation plans and what those are about, and also how they can influence housing policy. After that, I'm going to return with a couple examples, one in particular from California, also touch on Colorado and Ohio. And then we're going to close by considering what a pilot effort could look like and have a just general discussion about where we might go in Pennsylvania and in other spots. So with that, okay, I'm gonna keep going here on Adam and I are sort of juggling back and forth on the slides, so I'm just making sure the right sequence. Before we get into technical details about tax credits and allocation plans, I want to start with the households we're trying to serve. When we talk about housing stability, we need to think about households and think about how they actually exist. And for many households, that includes a pet. So the scale of this mismatch that I've talked about becomes more clear when we look at a couple of numbers. About 2/3 of households in the US include a pet. 71% is the most recent number from APPA in 2025. You'll see differing numbers, but they all land around 2/3. At the same time, though, only about 8% of rental properties are free of both breed and size restrictions. Those aren't perfectly parallel measures, but together they do illustrate the central issue that we're looking at, which is that demand and supply are badly misaligned. A property may be advertised as pet friendly because it permits at least one type of pet while still maintaining restrictions that include a substantial share of renters with pets. And from a housing policy perspective, in particular, this is more than a lifestyle preference. It represents a gap between the characteristics of real households and the policies governing available housing. And that gap can have meaningful consequences for housing stability. Because for many households, pets play a crucial role in family stability. Lower income renters can be especially affected because they generally have fewer housing options and less financial flexibility. A household may find a unit it can afford, but then encounter a breed restriction, a weight limit, recurring pet rent, or another condition that makes the unit unavailable in practice. These barriers can force people to choose between housing and an animal that they consider to be part of their family. They can also prolong housing searches, increase costs, or contribute to housing instability. So that's why we believe that pets should be considered within this broader conversation about access to stable, affordable housing. And one reason that the barriers are often overlooked is that the phrase pet friendly tells us very little about what a renter is actually going to experience. Pet friendly is not a well-defined term. It's not standardized in any particular way. What we do know is that 76% of housing operators, this is from research that PIHI did in 2019, and we've checked the number a couple of times, it stays about the same. About 76% of housing operators say their properties are pet friendly. But when you consider realities like cats accepted but not dogs, or dogs being accepted but not cats, we think about breed restrictions, we think about weight and size restrictions, we think about limitations on the number of pets or non-refundable fees or pet rent, lack of amenities for pets, and generally an unwelcoming environment. It's not really surprising that 72% of renters say that pet-friendly housing is hard to find. So we have about 3/4 of housing operators, housing providers saying they're pet-friendly, and this about the same percentage of renters saying that they can't find pet-friendly housing. And in the end, only 8% of rental housing is free of all pet restrictions. And that's even before we start factoring in fees and other things. This is just thinking about breed and size restrictions. So we use the term pet friendly to describe housing that allows at least one pet. So that's just pet friendly. I mean, we could also just call it pets allowed. It's the frequently used, it's the popular term, but this is true regardless of any restrictions that may be in place. So we distinguish that from pet inclusive. We think it's a very different term. It's not a substitute term. We use pet inclusive to describe housing that substantially reduces the unnecessary barriers. For example, they won't have breed restrictions. In a perfect world, as we move from the orange to the green on this chart, on this table, these things would apply. No breed restrictions, no weight or size restrictions, no fees that don't have a corresponding benefit, and basic policies or amenities that support residents with pets. It's important to note, and we have this conversation often with housing providers, this does not mean eliminating reasonable property rules. Housing providers can still address concerns such as behavior, nuisance, sanitation, damage, and safety. The goal, though, is to move away from broad assumptions based on breed, size, or appearance and toward more accurate, individualized ways of understanding risk. And just to see how this plays out on a practical basis, we can look at these numbers. The blue bar here represents the percentage of units we track that allow pets. So these are the nominally pet-friendly rental units. So you can see that number's pretty high. It's over 70% of all these places we're looking at in this chart, just to give you an idea of kind of what's local to the folks, a lot of the folks participating today. So if you think back to that number of people, households that have pets, 70% or so, this should be sufficient. But the problem is when we go to this orange bar and we look at how few properties do not have breed or size restrictions, the gap between the bars tells the story that so many pet owning renters face. They seek out a place to live that is pet friendly nominally, only to find out that their particular pet is not welcome. So we've got a clear housing access problem. Many households have pets, but a relatively small portion of rental housing is meaningfully inclusive. So the question is, where can policy, for us as we think about policy, where can a policy create change at scale? Affordable housing is especially important because public financing does more than help buildings get constructed. It also shapes priorities, requirements, and operating practices. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Adam to explain some of the details behind low-income housing tax credit programs, the role of qualified allocation plans, and why those systems can be powerful policy levers. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Ross. And what you are presenting really is a challenge that's common to many issues in the housing space. There's often a big gap between what policies purport to provide or what landlords or other housing providers purport to be saying in terms of things like pet friendly and what people actually experience, in this case, people and their pets experience on the ground in terms of real access. I'm going to focus the next part of this presentation on sharing information about a very powerful tool for changing housing policy and using an example from a different area of our work, which is about location and fair housing as a potential model to look at for pet-friendly housing and pet-inclusive housing, more importantly. I'll tell you how we got into this work. About 25 years ago, one of our board members, then the president of the NAACP in the city of Camden, came to us and said, why is all this new affordable housing going up in this neighborhood in South Camden next to an incinerator and a concrete plant, one of the most environmentally burdened neighborhoods in the United States, a neighborhood with one of the highest rates of childhood asthma in the United States. Nobody in this neighborhood asked for this or wanted it, and yet it seems to be that we're building a ton of affordable housing here in the worst possible location in Camden. And we started to look into it. And the reason was because this federal and state program, the low-income housing tax credits, had a set of policies that were incentivizing and driving housing into that neighborhood. And we then worked with the Camden NAACP and several organizations to bring a lawsuit against our state housing finance agency, which was the first of its kind in the United States, about how the incentives were structured in a way that was driving housing towards neighborhoods that were putting kids at risk and really were not advancing significant public policies. And that sparked a whole movement, first in New Jersey and then across the country, of rethinking how this powerful tool can be used in terms of incentives for creating housing in neighborhoods that offer good access to opportunity, jobs, transit, and a safe environment. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how that unfolded and what this program is. Let's go to the next slide. So what are low-income housing tax credits? This is a massive program that I'm sure many people have not heard much about, if anything. It is the largest federal program for financing affordable rental housing. It was created in 1986, and it is a federal pass-through to the states. And incredibly, 25% of all new apartment construction in the 2000s and 2010s, according to census data, came out of this single program. That's not 25% of affordable housing. It's 25% of all new apartments created in the United States came through this federal program. Every state has a series of a quantity of tax credits that then there's a state agency called a housing finance agency that sets the rules and has a competition every year as to how to allocate tax credits. And so this federal tax incentive gets passed to the state finance agency that is then passed on to affordable housing developments. Next slide, please, Ross. Thanks. And so basically every state has this thing called the QAP, the Qualified Allocation Plan. And that is a scoring system. And developers who are seeking to build affordable housing, again, a quarter of all new rental housing in the US, respond to the scoring system very acutely because they want to win the competition. And very small changes in that competition can totally reshape the housing that's created. And there's all kinds of examples of what a QAP can reward. I talked about the example in Camden of location, and I'll talk about some of what we were able to win through the work that we did with the Camden groups and other groups throughout the state around location and transit access. Also, there's been a really strong effort in New Jersey and nationally around energy efficiency, making climate resilient buildings that have up-to-date energy technology, making sure there's housing accessible to families and not just small, studios or one bedrooms. Accessibility around access for people with disabilities. Strong resident services. This is also something we've led the way on in New Jersey of requiring integrated supportive services, especially for families experiencing homelessness. And we're starting to see the same incentive structure, as Ross is going to focus on, trickle in to requiring pet inclusive housing. Next slide, please, Ross. So what did we do when we filed this lawsuit against the state of New Jersey? Originally, housing was basically being concentrated into extremely high poverty areas. And before 2003, only 12% of tax credit homes were located in low poverty areas. We were able to succeed in getting the state to change its scoring criteria, and we quadrupled that rate within a decade. So we very much changed the incentive structure. And even more importantly, beyond even that number, at a more granular level, there were particular restrictions put into place about these environmental impacts and health impacts. It basically became impossible to build new affordable housing close to an incinerator, a concrete plant, other major negative sites. And previously, basically, developers, those sites were very cheap. So they said, we can get really cheap land next to this incinerator, and they were able to make more money off of the program. We were able to get secure changes working with groups like the Camden NAACP to ban that practice. And instead, we shifted to points that rewarded access to transit, energy efficiency, and location near high-performing schools. And so over time, we've had tens of thousands more families getting access to high-opportunity neighborhoods. And as I said, we were the first people to do this in the United States. But through networks, there's a lot of there's only 50 state housing finance agencies. It's a small set of people and agencies that control basically 25% of apartment construction in America. And other states, and both Republican and Democratic states, Texas and Massachusetts are two examples of leaders, then followed what we did in New Jersey through a coordinated strategy in which leaders from our state presented at national conferences about their strategy and got other people to buy in. Next slide, please. And I'm just going to very quickly go through a few examples of what this has actually meant in terms of the location of affordable housing through this change. These are all developments that would have never happened without the changes that we were able to win with our allies through this process. So this is in Edison, New Jersey. It's about 30 miles outside New York City. This is a really incredible development on a former decommissioned federal military land that redeveloped in this very desirable suburb of New York, this land into 120 units, and there's 30 of the units are actually supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness. And that is the kind of development that if there hadn't been specific incentives for locations in communities like Edison that are really strong markets. Edison's a huge job center, and also extra points in the scoring system for serving people experiencing homelessness, then this development would have never been built. Next slide, please. So this development actually is came out of our original work, and it is a national landmark. There's been national studies of it. Ethel R. Lawrence Homes in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. Actually, we have an organization that is a separate nonprofit founded by a lot of the same people as our organization actually built this. And there's now 176 affordable townhomes there, and this has been a national model. There was a study from a team of researchers at Princeton University finding that this was creating Mount Laurel is, again, it's for those of you who are from this area, it's a massive job center. It has a great school system. This is a beautiful, beautiful site that is surrounded by a tremendous amount of open space. And there was a study about the impacts on the kids and families who moved here versus people who applied and didn't get in by a team of researchers at Princeton. And they found that all kinds of incredible impacts, massive economic impacts on families, and interestingly, a lot of health impacts. It's something we don't often think about in housing. The mental health impacts on the people moving here versus people who didn't get in were basically equivalent to the strongest impacts that you see from antidepressants, which is a pretty incredible finding. And also we found that many kids who became the first people ever in their families to go to college. So this is just generational change. And again, if you go back to that same question, if the incentives had not been in place, it's a lot more expensive to buy land in a place like Mount Laurel than it is next to an incinerator in Camden. And it's only by the incentives being in place to say, if you do that, you're more likely to get these credits, that these projects became possible. And I have one more to show. One of the other things we really focused on is even within urban areas, really focusing on areas that were experiencing displacement and addressing gentrification. And so I remember early on in this process, sitting down with the head of the housing authority in Jersey City saying, it has become impossible for the city of Jersey City to get tax credits because we just always lose out because it's more expensive to buy land in Jersey City than it is even other cities like Camden. And so we then worked in a second generation of changing these incentives to have a pot of these credits that were focusing on areas that were experiencing at risk of displacement, and not just having it be a lowest cost area. And this is an example of development in Bergen Lafayette, which, if any of you know Jersey City, it's an area that has historically been a multiracial, lower income area experiencing a lot of gentrification and displacement risk. And this is an example of a development that new incentive system made possible. And so again, before I turn it back over to Ross, these are obviously examples that are more about citing, but what to take away for this conversation today is that this is an incredibly powerful lever that impacts a quarter of all new rental housing built in the US. So, Ross, back to your numbers. I mean, that's roughly itself triple the percentage of units that right now we're seeing in our region that are pet inclusive. And so there's a huge opportunity if we are able to get on the same train that some of these citing things did, of a couple states pioneering and taking the lead, and that spreading nationally as a practice to really having a very big impact going forward on the share of housing that's pet inclusive. So we'll turn it back to you, Ross.
Ross, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Thanks, Anne, for sharing that with us. And I think one of the things that I'll emphasize as I go through these next slides is the variety of ways that tools can be used, right? They could put in different situations and put different pieces together to come up with the right situation or the right approach for for each individual situation. And so I want to begin to apply the same model that Adam was talking about to pet-friendly housing. If states begin to reward pet-friendly design, reasonable pet policies, pet amenities, developers would have stronger incentives to include those features, and landlords and owners of buildings would have increased incentive as those properties come online to enforce and to put in place those pet-friendly properties. So if we want affordable housing that better meets residents' needs, we're going to need to reform the incentives to shape what gets built. So get into California and its pet-friendly housing as far as QAP goes, and also what they did with the legislature. So let's jump into that. So it's going to be helpful now that we understand more about how LIHTC and QAPs work. When it comes to pets, I'm going to show this California example. The reason we're showing the California example is because it's the most developed example that we have identified, although it did not begin with the QAP scoring change. California used legislation to establish a policy, public financing to extend its reach, and then agency administration to translate it into property level practice. So all these pieces coming together. So in this case, public financing became a lever for changing the rules in what we call covered affordable housing, or affordable housing funded by the state financing agencies. This evolution happened in stages. So let's walk through that a little bit. In 2017, California enacted Assembly Bill 1137, which is also known as the Pet Friendly Housing Act. This established pet requirements for affordable housing funded by the California Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD. Implementation of this began in 2018 as newly covered HCD projects became subject to this requirement. In 2022, the legislature enacted Senate Bill 971, which expanded the policy to qualifying LIHTC developments and strengthened the substantive protections underneath that. So the expanded requirements took effect in 2023 through HCD and CTAC administration. CTAC is the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee. I put those notes down on the bottom of the slides because I have to remind myself what those things stand for. Today, California provides one model for other states, but not necessarily the only model, or not even the easiest model to replicate. But the important thing to notice is the expansion of reach. California began with this financing channel where it had strong leverage, HCD-funded housing, and later extended the approach to qualifying LIHTC properties. So why did California use legislation rather than begin with the QAP approach that Adam described? So I recently spoke with a colleague, Susan Riggs from the ASPCA. I don't know if Susan's on the call, but I know some people on the call will know her. Susan was involved in both pieces of legislation and continues to be a powerful leader in this area of pet inclusive housing. So when I spoke to her about reaching back to what she could recall and what she still knows about these pieces of legislation, her explanation was that California has an unusually substantial state affordable housing infrastructure. HCD provides or administers resources that touch many, if not most, affordable housing projects, including many projects that also use LIHTC. So that meant that a statutory approach operating through HCD and later through the LIHTC system could achieve broader reach than just going with the QAP approach. It's also more durable because it's in the statute as opposed to just being only administered through the QAPs. However, this doesn't mean the legislation is the best path in every state. I want to emphasize that, and that's back to my point about different ways to approach this. This particular solution reflects California's structure, available resource, and existing statutory framework. So I think we're going to need to consider that as we're thinking about what we do next in particular states. What is the best mechanism to use? In states where the Housing Finance Agency or QAP is the more accessible lever, the strategy is going to look really different than it did in California. I want to talk a little about Senate Bill 971 because that's the piece that really brought this into the robust legislation is today. So Senate Bill 971 made several important changes. First, it expanded coverage to qualifying developments receiving state or federal low-income housing tax credits. Second, it made the policy more meaningful and inclusive. And this is when we talk about moving from pet friendly to pet inclusive. It did things like prohibit breed restrictions, prohibit weight restrictions, and it prohibited monthly pet rent in HCD covered housing. So it required those properties receiving the state funding to move along that pet inclusive housing path. At the same time, this is important, it preserves reasonable management rules. Housing providers can still address nuisance behavior, safety, number of pets, and other legitimate property management concerns. It's bringing a balance to that relationship to the movement towards pet inclusive housing. The law doesn't eliminate risk management, which is the big piece for housing providers. I mean, that's risk management is a big reason why these restrictions and policies exist. And it doesn't eliminate that risk, but it does provide the path towards tools that may be used to manage the risk differently than the arbitrary or very rigid breed and size restrictions. So California, taken as a whole, demonstrates that this policy change is possible. What it does not yet give us is a complete picture of the outcomes. So one of my takeaways from conversation with Susan and just looking at this, and I talked about how I come from a data background, and so it's important that as we look at these outcomes, we have a way to recognize how effective they're being, especially if we're going to try to take them other places, right? We want to be able to prove what has worked. So at this point, implementation outcomes don't appear to be systematically tracked as pet policy outcomes. So we still need to understand things like what property policies actually changed. Are covered developments constantly complying? What have owners and property managers learned? What has the renter experience been like? And I think for me, most importantly, have the changes affected access, costs, complaints, retention, or to the point that Chaitanya made earlier, shelter relinquishment, right? Are we seeing positive movement on those factors? Because those are the things that are going to make a difference in people's lives. So there may be relevant information within the housing compliance documentation or even individual property records, but we haven't yet identified a centralized database data set that answers these questions. So look at California both as a policy model, but also a research opportunity. And so this is one place to try to dig in and see, because they use all these they combine several pieces in California. It's a way to look at those, potentially isolate the effectiveness of them, but also look at them as a whole and see what they did. And California is not the only state exploring this connection. I'm just going to mention a few here. California represents one legislative approach followed by agency implementation. Colorado has combined state financing requirements with housing finance agencies, and QAP related approaches. So it's more of a hybrid model. And then Ohio represents a QAP or scoring based approach where they're exploring how to do that. I think primarily through QAP at this point, through QAP scoring. So I'm intentionally keeping these other examples at a pretty high level because the details differ, and California remains the example we understand most fully at this time. But the comparison makes the point that there isn't a single path to putting these things in place. A state may use legislation, it may use QAP, it may attach requirements to state financing, or it may combine several of those tools. So that brings us to the broader lesson for Pennsylvania and for other states. Again, the lesson is not that every state should try to reproduce California's laws. They may not be the right setting for that. But the lesson is to identify where each affordable housing system creates leverage that can be used. The leverage might be found in statute, might be found in the housing finance agency rules, QAP scoring, the funding agreements, or local housing programs. The right pathway will depend on the state structure, the authority of its agencies, the available funding streams, and also the political environment. So a strategic question is not, you don't want to have this be a discussion about can we pass California's law here. It's more about where does the state I'm looking at already make decisions that shape affordable housing policy, and how could pet inclusivity be incorporated into that process? So with that framing, I turn it back to Adam for any thoughts, and then I think we will want to open it up for questions and discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. And really appreciate especially this last slide. I mean, it's really about looking at the context of a local state and figuring out how to both implement it in a way that makes sense for that state's programs. California does have a very different suite of housing programs than most states, and it does make California, interestingly, has passed over 100 affordable housing reform statutes in the last decade. That's a real outlier, and so there's a lot of other places in which pursuing something through regulation may make more sense. I also really want to emphasize it's looking at the state opportunity, but also getting that information sharing going. A lot of really the critical success of taking the really good work that our housing finance agency did in New Jersey and getting other states like Texas and Massachusetts to follow on it was having an explicit strategy for both advocates and also allies inside of government to share lessons learned with their colleagues. And so just as we're thinking about this, think about who are those messengers as we're just starting to see adoption and inclusion of inclusive housing in these policies, who can help take it from something that most people who are making decisions and advocating haven't heard about to something that's in serious consideration. Because, as common sense as the things that I say about not putting affordable housing to incinerator probably sound to all of you now, I mean, this was a really cutting edge idea 25 years ago, and really no state had initially adopted the kind of siting and location criteria that led to the examples of the developments I shared. And it took a while to actually get to the point of there being momentum of saying, no, this is something that really deserves serious policy consideration and that people should be taking into account. And so with that, absolutely would really like to reserve the rest of the time to hear what you all are thinking and engage in it back and forth. And I think you could either actually I'll turn it back to Chaitanya to talk about how we're going to do Q&A.
And I'll make one quick comment on top of that, Adam. Thanks for that perspective. Those of you involved in animal welfare and have looked at policy that's being pursued across states and even a little bit at the federal, but mostly in states and local jurisdictions, a lot of those efforts have been around removing breed restrictions, removing size restrictions directly, right? Or limiting fees, capping fees directly. Those efforts or being transparent about your pet policies, those things are still in motion, and we're going to continue to pursue those. Why this makes a lot of sense, this approach that Adam has talked about and that we've talked about today, is because it's the one that provides an incentive for businesses to move forward with putting more pet inclusive housing in place. It's kind of the carrot versus the stick approach, right? I mean, so instead of saying you have to do this, like there's funding for you if you do this. That's a powerful difference when it comes to talking to housing providers about making changes. So that's why I think this is a really important thing, because they'll always ask us, if I make these changes, what's in it for me, right? Why should I do this? There's no financial, I don't see a financial benefit to doing this, is what they can say. And we can talk about retention being greater for pets. That's all true. But in the end, this incentive-based piece is, we think, going to be a more powerful mover.
Great. So I'm seeing a couple comments in the chat. MSPCA, Jamie, you've mentioned that MSPCA is also thinking of kind of looking at QAP in the future. Did you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes, of course. I hope folks can see and hear me. So I'm the housing policy specialist, leading for Action for Pet Inclusive Housing campaign at MSPCA. And yes, we have had our eye on pursuing or proposing an amendment to the QAP since the very beginning. But the way the timing lined up with me coming on board to launch this campaign, they had just closed out an amendment period, so it's not open yet. But when it reopens for the next round, we intend to be at the table, and we're having the conversations early with our housing finance agency. Now we've already floated this. We were able to meet with the newly appointed secretary of the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, as it's called here, very recently, and have started having these conversations early to say that this is what our intent is. And we've found thus far, we're also having these conversations at the local level. Massachusetts has finance pots of money at the local level, at the city level for housing development. And so we're hoping to bring, we've already brought proposals for incentives, an incentives-based approach to the city of Boston, the mayor's office of housing, to see if what are some innovative ways that we can incentivize developers to adopt a more pet-friendly approach. If we can't get to pet inclusive, can we get from no pet to pets allowed? We're open to all forms of winning when it comes to accommodating pet families. And so far, my sense is that the incentives-based approach seems to be where we're getting the most traction, as opposed to a legislative mandate type approach. Less support we're finding for that. So we're really leaning heavily into incentives, and those conversations they're going really well. And so what was, I think, most helpful was we were able to analyze data from 58 recently completed projects that were received financing from the city of Boston, and found that a majority of the units created in those 58 projects were no pets allowed at all. And then among those that were pets allowed, of course, there was a wide variation in restriction. And so when we were able to present this analysis to the Office of Housing, it was very eye-opening for them, because their office is full of pet people that were really open and sympathetic to our campaign and open to hearing us out. But they were shocked to learn that the steps that their office was taking to tackle our housing crisis was leaving pet families behind. So that was an approach that seems to really be opening more doors for further conversation around incentives that we're very happy about. So.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. I'm seeing a question in the chat from Janelle. Does this approach also help insurance companies get on board, since some of them are strict about breeds and refuse? We've heard this actually a lot. Ross, I'm sure you've heard this, is that landlords may be willing to kind of be pet inclusive, but the insurance companies are not supportive of it at all.
Yeah, I don't know, Adam, you can speak to whether there's been experience in trying to address some of those sort of ancillary pieces of this issue. But I would say that it doesn't necessarily specifically address insurance, this approach, but what it does, so what we know from talking to a lot of insurance providers and brokers is that they will do what their clients ask them to do. And so if over the long term, if you have a lot of housing providers come and say, we want to allow all breeds, they're going to change their policies because they're going to have to if they want to keep the business. And so the properties that we've spoken to, the owners and the managers of those properties that have been successful in removing breed restrictions have just gone on the insurance company and said, look, we're going to do this, right? So what do we have to do to make it happen? Do we need to add something to our pet agreement? What do we need to do? We're going to do that. They will change. In the end, the insurance companies, think about the issues that insurance companies deal with primarily when it comes to properties. It's fires, it's flooding, it's not pets, right? And so it's just not their most important issue to go after. So there's an opportunity with the incentive-based program. So it's like a chain, I think. If a developer wants to build a pet inclusive property and the insurance is getting in the way, they're going to go find an alternative and make that happen. So I think it's, again, leading with incentive as opposed to saying you have to do this.
Yeah,
what are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Insurance is a big question in all of affordable housing subsidy programs. I think, Ross, something that you said really, once there is a market, like if insurance companies know that basically all of the low-income housing tax credit developments are going to have pet inclusive properties, and as you say, Ross, if the developers that they already have a relationship with are coming to them and saying, we're going to need insurance for that, that's going to move conversations a whole lot quicker. I also see a good amount of housing finance agencies, once they're bought into a process, there's a number of insurance related issues that have come up with LIHTC over the years. And you can also often have those state agencies go to bat for actually figuring out how to address those issues. So I definitely think it would be helpful for dealing with insurance issues.
Great. Thank you. Penny, did you have a question? Do you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Yes, I do. Hi, guys.
Penny.
We've talked about this stuff before, and I certainly have arrived at the same conclusion that we need to look at incentives because, requirements around banning pet rent or additional deposits in a market where we're short millions of housing units is not. I feel like it'll send landlords and property owners in the wrong direction to just ban pets outright then. So I did have a discussion with a housing consultant in Pennsylvania, a LIHTC housing consultant, to developers to sort of get his impression of whether or not it would be realistic to get something into the evaluation criteria in the QAP to say, you get additional points if you have a pet inclusive policy. And his concern was that the profit margins on these projects are so low and that the developers have to resell the project to a financial institution, and the rules don't let them include additional security deposits or additional pet rent in their profitability calculation, so that it could push the projects into not being profitable if you say you have to be pet inclusive, but you can't include any extra income from that. So does that ring true to you guys, or how would you address that?
It's sort of what developers say about any change in this space, honestly. I mean, I would say that the thing is, right now costs are pretty high and margins are pretty thin. But we had the same initial response when we were talking about setting criteria. We had similar things that I've seen around. For example, there was a really strong, the stuff I mentioned about energy efficiency was the subject of a pretty incredible national organized movement and advocacy. And developers said the same thing. I mean, I do think that you have to be to listen to and see. Ross and I have talked about this some. If there's real cost models, I mean, you can do things like account for that as an eligible expense, and there's a thing called replacement reserves that are part of every one of these projects, and say that that's an eligible expense and factor that into the overall formula. But I kind of see it in the same way that Ross talked about insurers. I just don't think, in the scheme of how big these projects are, that what we're talking about in terms of purported losses from having pet inclusive housing is going to be the make or break financing thing for every project. That being said, obviously this is a process of advocacy and persuasion, and so figuring out how you really, what Ross said, and also really, before, in terms of the discussion about Massachusetts, about like amassing data is always a really helpful piece. The people who are making decisions on that tend to be very wonky and open to arguments involving data, and so I definitely think, to the degree there's data on that's possible, but I think it is a sort of a standard industry consultant response to say those kinds of things, in my experience.
Yeah,
Great.
nothing to add to that, I think. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. Shannon, I see your hand up. Shannon, did you want to share?
Hi, yes.
Hey.
Thank you so much for this presentation. This is of particular interest. My organization, Humane Action Pennsylvania, has actually gotten a commitment from two state reps to introduce a ban, so kind of what you're advising against, of breed and size restrictions. We were basically told by people we approached that the financial side, the caps and stuff, would be too difficult to pursue at this time, but they thought breed and size restrictions might be something that was doable. And then, of course, with the election coming up, the makeup of the chambers might differ, and that could be huge if we had the same party in both chambers. I guess my question is, when you say that incentives are the way to go, is it because just the lobby against this because of landlords would be so strong that it doesn't have a chance of getting passed? I guess I just want to have a much better understanding of why maybe our approach is not the correct one before our legislation is introduced.
Yeah, so I want to be careful on that, because I don't want to say I look at this approach through the finance agencies as being another toolkit for people trying to advance these policies, right? I absolutely think there's a place for breed and size restriction bans. I think there's a place for removing or capping pet rents and deposits. So I think all these things need to come together, right? And I think that the right solution is really going to depend on what your state, what's your city, what's your county look like, right? I mean, Sam, we work with you on the Pennsylvania stuff, so we would never. I mean, we've talked about what you want to do, and we're in support of that, right? We've got to be doing all these things, think about all of these things, right? And ultimately, the breed and size restrictions need to be removed one way or another, right? They need to. So this is another way of forcing that to happen, right? So whether you do that through hitting with the stick or giving them something good to go after, that's the choice we need to make. But yes, the lobbying for these housing associations is very strong. It's very strong. And so, we can put out what we think is a very sort of vanilla proposal for legislation. And before you know it, the Department of Associated Greater Los Angeles is sending an email out to all of their membership saying, look what they're trying to do to us. Right. And so I think part of it is us getting in front of those discussions and having so we can build partnerships and bridges with it. But if we can be saying we're doing this, but also, hey, we're doing this other thing that's going to be a benefit to you, right? Take advantage of these incentives that are in place, then it might change the discussion. That's our hope, is that we come with more solutions, more potential solutions, and we get to a better place faster. But I'm absolutely not saying that approach of removing breed and size restrictions is wrong. Absolutely not. So.
Great.
Thank you.
And I appreciate the work you guys are doing on this. I know you're very far along on that path, so it's exciting.
Yeah, maybe just a very brief follow-up on that. I think in general, housing tends to be a fairly complex policy arena, and really having multiple levers and multiple strategies tends to be the best way to come up with success. And so, I don't think these things are mutually exclusive at all.
Thank you.
So we have a comment in the chat from Julie. She says, Ross and Adam, how about submitting to have a similar presentation to the next National Council of State Housing Finance Agencies annual conference to get the trade association's attention?
So that's a great idea, and this is something we've worked on in our prior work. In my experience, the most successful route to do that is to get somebody who is at a state housing finance agency to take the lead on submitting it, because it's really like a trade association conference that is really primarily by and for the people in the state agencies. And so I think that since it seems like California is further along, and maybe some of the other places like Ohio. I mean, I think that the strongest way to do that is like if you had people from 3 agencies that jointly submitted a proposal. I think that has a very high likelihood of being accepted. They tend to be a little more skittish in my experience about something that's entirely driven by, non-housing housing agency staff. So I do think that conference is a very powerful tool. So I do think that would be a good strategy. Oh, that's great. Look at that. Colorado. So the Colorado HFA did a present. Oh, well, yeah, I mean, that's great. So,
Yeah, well, I'll mention, and I'm a board member with My Dog Is My Home, and I've also had a 30-year career in affordable housing, starting with Fannie Mae making its first investments. And my experience with NCSHA is that you're right, they're going to listen to their members. And Susan Riggs, Christine Kim, and I were on a panel actually twice at the Colorado Housing Finance Agency's annual conference talking about this very thing. And look, they're making progress on the state level in Colorado. So thanks to Susan and really her work, and we support her. So I think that should be a ball that should get rolling.
That's great. Thanks so much, Julie.
Yeah.
We've kind of come to the end of our webinar. Thank you, Ross and Adam, so much for sharing this information with us. Thanks everyone else who chimed in. There's clearly a lot of work happening in this space, and there's a lot more that we can share and do. So we'll keep this we'll find ways to keep this conversation going. But for now, I just want to thank Adam and Ross, and also to thank all of you for joining us. In a minute, you're going to see a QR code that will take you to a survey. So please fill out the survey. And also feel free to reach out to me and let me know, how did this webinar land for you? How might you use this information? And also, what types of programming might you like to see moving forward? So anyone who knows me knows that I love hearing from the Life of Riley community, so please do reach out to me. And next week, please look out for our follow-up email, which will include the recording from today's webinar, along with additional resources from Ross and Adam, and of course, a link to our next webinar, which will be in October. So thank you again, Ross and Adam, and thank you to everyone for being part of the Life of Riley community today. We appreciate you.